slate. Ruby slate. Thank you. 3, 2, 1, and action.
Hello, I'm Janet Bridgers with Earth Alert. We're back for another episode of Heroes of the Coast. These are the personal stories of people who have helped protect the California coast for all of us to enjoy. And I'm very pleased to have as our guest today Dr. Bradford Lundberg. Doctor, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So, right off the bat, I'm curious. You're a Harvard-trained internist, correct?
Yeah, essentially. I went to Harvard Medical School and then trained elsewhere. But
So, how did you become involved in coastal issues?
well, actually, by the time I was appointed to the Regional Coastal Commission after the passage of Prop 20, I already had sort of a reputation for being an environmental jack of all trades. I had been involved in the Jenner gravel fight, in the Warm Springs Dam water storage fight, in the Annandale Park fight, and partly on the basis of those things, Barry Keene, who was a young, recently elected assemblyman from this area, and I had become good friends, and he had recommended to Bob Moretti that although I hadn't been involved really in strictly coastal issues, that I would somehow be a safe and fit appointee to the regional commission. And one of my problems, I have to admit, through most of these years is that I don't say no very easily. So I ended up with more things on my plate than I probably had any business having. But
So, the question, how did you find time for this, is you just...
yeah, I was also milking goats and doing other silly things. So.
But you told me earlier you had previously been on the Water Quality Control Board.
I was on the Regional Water Quality Control Board, the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, which ran Sonoma, Humboldt, and Del Norte counties. And I was doing that at the time that, for the first time, the state water quality structure and its regional boards had taken on logging as a water quality issue. They had not addressed those non-point discharges, so-called. And they appointed me because I had been involved in these other issues, but I found myself in the middle of some real fights over water quality's right to take on the timber industry in the support of water quality, which it had not done before.
How would you compare the work of the Water Quality Control Boards with the work of the Coastal Commission?
They were quite different. The Porter-Cologne Act that I think, if I remember correctly, created the water quality structure as it existed when I was there, specified that the regional boards would be made up predominantly of representatives of the water users and of the people who were regulated by the Water Quality Control Board. So we had a timber industry representative and a farming representative and a municipal water discharge representative. Fortunately, most of them were people of real integrity, and I think we were able to do a reasonably good job, but there was still the expectation that those established water users were going to be carefully protected and protected by their representatives on the board. I mean, clearly the Coastal Act did not envision anything quite like that. The fact that most of the regional commissions had representatives of local government on them, was an issue in some cases, particularly in Sonoma County, interestingly. But still they were a minority, and they were a helpful voice for the most part. But on the water quality boards, it was very slow to get things through that would force even badly needed change on the timber industry or on agriculture or on municipal wastewater discharge.
The structure, though, of the state water quality control board with the regional commissions became part of the first phase of
That's right.
after Prop 20, though.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
and
And that was a good model, actually. In that respect, its shortcoming was the representation by the regulated. It put them in very awkward positions where things that they knew perfectly well that the law required and that science required would be awkward for their own industry locally. So that got people into some very awkward situations.
this is in the regional coastal commissions.
No, well, I'm speaking of the water quality control boards.
Okay.
In the coastal commissions, because in Sonoma County, for example, the first our first regional commission, had the West County supervisor as one of its members. But he was only one out of a fairly large regional commission. So even though, and he, I think by his basic preferences, was not an enthusiastic supporter of the act. He tried very hard to do an honest job, but he also was able, to sort of lay off responsibility on the rest of us who were simply not in that position.
Blame the rest of you, huh? Well, you've kind of gotten into a question I was going to ask about after the passage of Prop 20 in November 1972. The Coastal Commission had to begin functioning very rapidly because they had to serve the needs of people who were looking for development permits. So
Right.
what do you remember about what went well, what didn't go well, the spirit of the commission? Was everybody trying very hard to make it work?
I think everybody truly wanted it to work and tried to make it work. But right off the bat, we were dealing with things that people hadn't had to deal with before. We were fortunate, I think, among many respects, in the fact that BCDC had preceded us by a few years.
Those initials stand for?
Bay Conservation and Development Commission, the product of what, 3 or 4 UC faculty wives who decided that the bay, really should not be destroyed, and did a real job, and managed to get people used to thinking in terms that for many people, I think, got translated into the coastal issues. And of course, the State Coastal Commission exec came from BCDC, Joe Bonavitz, as did the chair, Mel Lane. So in that respect, we sort of were able to get off to a running start, but still, basically, there was just too much going on the coast at that point that was going to have to change under even the provisions of the initiative for people to accept it easily. The prime example of that for us in this regional commission was Sea Ranch. Sea Ranch was already underway. It had sold quite a few lots. The Olson Ranch had been bought by a subsidiary of Castle and Cook in Hawaii that had been set up specifically to develop land. I never actually saw the ads to prove it, but I was assured by a number of the purchasers of land that they had been assured by the sales force, and they had seen advertisements that made clear that all of the beaches in the tidelands along the 10 miles of Sea Ranch would be accessible only to Sea Ranch property owners. And it was things like that that made it very, very appealing. To suddenly be told that was illegal, and that you know, if they were going to apply for building permits, or Castle and Cook was going to apply for further subdivision permits, the condition of it would have to be public access to the beaches, was just, you know, dynamite right from the get-go.
You mentioned what those lots were selling for at the time.
Well, I was talking about just a random lot in the rest of the coast. I mean, my secretary had a cousin who had a couple hundred acres on up toward Anchor Bay, as I remember, and he was selling an acre right on the bluff front, looking right down on the beach, for $1,000. And nobody was buying it. I mean, there was not much of a history of second homes at that point in time, in the late 60s, early 70s, and certainly coastal development had really not occurred very much. So I think Castle and Cook Oceanic Properties, you know, took some fair chances investing what they did, and hoping that they would have the demand and the sales. It's not easy to get to that section of coast. They were hoping that the state was going to buy the Kelly Road, which comes over from Cloverdale to Stewart's Point, and that would allow people to circumvent the little windy road that to this day they still take. The state was in no position to do any such thing. So the whole thing was confusing and contentious, but certainly the fact that now suddenly you weren't going to be able to build a house at Sea Ranch without having a coastal permit, as well as local building permits and the local CNRs of the Sea Ranch Association, just introduced a lot of resentment and anger, which unfortunately the nice guy who took over who became the chair of the regional commission at the very onset was aware that I was a good friend, had been a fraternity brother of the president of Oceanic Properties, and that my parents were living up there, and so obviously I should take on Sea Ranch as my private little project, beginning on the regional commission, which ended up probably changing my life more than anything else that happened to me in the Coastal Commission. And it was a very difficult time. I ultimately went on the state commission, became its chair for a period, having vowed that I would remain on the commission until Sea Ranch was settled and people really finally understood it and learned how to work with it, and everybody could get on with their lives. That finally seemed to have happened in 1978, and I made plans to leave and notified everybody. And shortly thereafter, the Sea Ranch Association made a deal with one of the legislators to introduce new legislation that took everything that we had all agreed and turned it on its head. And it was another 3 to 4 years, as I remember, before sea ranchers finally could build and understand what the rules were. I didn't stay. I left. But
So when did you leave?
Yeah.
Oh,
I was milking goats every day and running a medical practice, and I needed to get on with my life. And you know, I think I was one of I'm sure a whole army of people for whom, you know, our involvement with the commission, involvement with the initiative, with those who were involved with it, were important parts of their lives. But on the other hand, that they were also heavily involved some of them in environmental things, some of them in social issues. It was an interesting group of people, varied people, bright, dedicated, but you know, I have heard you mention earlier that one of your hopes was to encourage young people to look at models like this of you know, public involvement. I can't imagine a better one than the commission history to point out to kids that it really doesn't matter what else your interests might be. If your interests include you know, the public benefit through you know, political action or volunteering or serving under any circumstances on boards or commissions, there's no limit to what your other interests or skills or talents might be. God knows the Coastal Commission, I think, demonstrated it.
Well, I do know that young people perhaps have the idea that if you don't have advanced degrees or vast
Sure.
experience, that you're not valued in these efforts, and that's absolutely false, because everybody is important, and every bit of time that people can devote is valued and important. But then also the joy of it, though, is is that you meet such wonderful people.
Interesting people, certainly.
Very, very interesting people. So Sea Ranch certainly was maybe the major headache you were dealing with. What other issues can stand out? Are there?
I found that the challenge that weighed most heavily on me was to do anything I could to help ensure that the commissions functioned well and legitimately in such a way that their deliberations and their decisions were trusted and respected. I mean, it was controversial enough. There were enough special interests involved. The commissioners themselves came from enough different angles. You know, I myself was personally sufficiently aware of and subjected to the tug and haul of various interests to know that you know, that was not something that was going to happen automatically. And I worked pretty hard to try to, when I ultimately became chair, to try and still see through some of the very legitimate, understandable allegiances of staff and commission members or people that we were close to, but to still remember that we had a very important, complex job to do, and a set of laws and precedences that needed to be honored. I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but we fortunately had an excellent legal staff and an excellent planning staff, and so respecting all of that and helping the commission deal in a credible, trustworthy way with all of the issues was probably the thing that was, you know, the biggest challenge to me. There was one large property down in the Santa Barbara area that was comparable to Sea Ranch that had somehow escaped some of what Sea Ranch was exposed to, which we needed to sort of bring under the system, and that was painful, and you know, there were some unhappy folks, but as long as what we did you know, was consistent in dealing with those things, why yeah, we managed to get most of it done. Individual issues, otherwise, God, you know, there was a stack like that, but I don't dream about them anymore.
Well, I never understood how members of the state commissions could possibly read through all the documents they would, that you would have to read through and actually retain the information and consider it, not just flip through it. So,
Yeah, once the new act was passed in '76, and once I went on the state commission, I realized that much of the work that the staff did on the regional commission and the issues that we were dealing with were far simpler, and the responsibilities of the commissioners were considerably simpler. Carrying on a medical practice and chairing the state commission and doing all of the homework and the study, which was a couple of days of the week spent just studying the staff material that we would get, was a very, very different undertaking. But again, if you wanted the proceedings and the decisions to be credible, then obviously you had to do that. And I'm sure that today they're doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure.
Well, but you had a sense of ethics about it. We've heard stories over the years about some of the appointees who were clearly not either intellectually qualified or they were not ethical. Do any of those people stand out in your mind? Did you encounter any of those types?
Yeah, sure.
You did?
But fortunately, only a few.
Only.
So frankly, they seemed like perfectly, honest, representative human beings. If you went through the community and picked people out, you would get some of those. They were in a minority. Once in a while, they would move an issue in a direction that we all really had to work to correct. I had personally some very uncomfortable relationships with some of the appointing authorities, but that I think was just, if for whatever reason you either wanted to be on it or at least you weren't smart enough to say no, then that's what you got. And I think for the most part, as far as I'm aware, even up through today, and I haven't stayed that closely attached to it, so obviously, what I'm saying isn't necessarily totally valid, but I think still by and large, despite all of those potential flaws, it's continued to be a very ethical, responsible, public benefit structure and process.
When we spoke to Michael Fisher, the second executive director of the Coastal Commission, he mentioned that one of his problems working with the regional commissions was that you had such different ethos from one end of California to the other. And he reminded us that the coast of California, if you flipped it over onto the East Coast, would go from Boston to Savannah, Georgia. Well, obviously, those are very different regions. So did they ever get all of you together? Did you ever, all the people who were on the regional commissions, did you?
We had a couple of statewide meetings. I mean, just to get together and discuss what our experiences had been and address a few issues in administration of the overall process. But mostly we functioned separately, and of course the applicants and the people on all sides had the state commission to turn to appeal. So that the state commission ended up having to deal with some of these aberrations that both the makeup of the regional commissions and the difference of the North Coast Commission comes of a different society essentially, and they were answering to a somewhat different culture, certainly than the South Coast Commission or the South Central. Yeah, they were. It's an interesting process.
Tell us about some of the personalities, the people who stand out in your mind that you remember from your days working with the commission.
Oh my.
Naomi Schwartz. Tell
Yeah.
us about Naomi Schwartz.
Yeah. Just a nice lady. Very bright, very dedicated. Gosh, I heard you talking earlier of Phyllis Faber. Phyllis and I, of course, were on the regional commission together, and she was just such a joy to work with.
Mel Lane. What kind of person was he?
Mel Lane, interestingly, married a junior high school classmate of mine, Joan, his wife, and I. We ran for student body office together in junior high school. Mel's a very interesting guy, and the comments earlier about his being somewhat more of a Republican than certainly many of the commission people. He's quite a conservative guy. He and Joe Bodovitz were obviously very fond and very respectful of each other, and neither of them would do anything to cross or hurt the other. But it was obvious that some of the choices and decisions and policies that we had to work with were not totally comfortable for Mel, I think. But because he still basically was a relatively conservative person. But, he'd spent all the time that he did on the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and having done an excellent job with Joe. So, I think he was an excellent, a wonderful example of people of certainly, different philosophy and environmental and social ethic that I still respected a lot and did a good job. Having to follow him as the chair was a little awkward. But
big shoes. We should go back and mention that Mel's family published Sunset Magazine.
Right.
And
Mel published the books, and his older brother, was responsible for the magazine essentially.
And those were successful operations, and
That's right.
still are apparently, at least
Yeah.
from the look. And but I remember reading it. Was this true that Mel lived very modestly, drove an old car? That was true.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially.
So.
Yeah. No, they were very, very straight, honest, very hardworking, very ethical people.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think was generally true of most of the commission, and how all of that came about. How people of that ilk became that interested in it and were willing to devote that much to it. They were not necessarily coastal people. I mean, I would say that Mel and Joan were not primarily interested in the coast. I think they were primarily interested in responsible government and responsible resource use, that sort of thing. Which I guess I am too, really. But
Well, thank you very, very much for this insight into the
thank
workings of the regional commissions and the
Thank
early
you.
days of the.
thank you for the work you're
Coastal
doing.
And
It's lovely.
Viewers, thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us for another episode of Heroes of the Coast next week.
3, 2, 1. Turn off your recorder.